hum of the engines was a hypnotic lullaby, a constant, low thrum that promised safety and distance. For the passengers on Flight 714, a transatlantic hop from Dulles to Heathrow, it was just another Tuesday. They were a microcosm of the world suspended in a pressurized metal tube 35,000 feet above the churning Atlantic. A young couple holding hands, a businessman staring intently at a spreadsheet, and in seat 1, to see a quiet man named Alex Cullix, was unremarkable in every way. He wore a simple gray hoodie, his brown hair was a little too long, and he was reading a dog-eared paperback. He looked like a graduate student, a backpacker, a man content to be lost in a crowd. He had a stillness about him, a certain calmness that seemed to belong to an older generation. He ordered a ginger ale, thanked the flight attendant with a nod, and returned to his book, a quiet ghost in the bustling cabin. In the cockpit, Captain Miller, a man with a quarter-century of flight experience etched into the lines around his eyes, was a different kind of calm. He was the picture of control, his hands resting lightly on the yoke. Next to him, his co-pilot, Sarah Jenkins, a bright, ambitious young woman on her first transatlantic route, was a mix of nerves and exhilaration. She watched the endless blue expanse, her training kicking in to keep her focused on the dozens of readouts and blinking lights. "Smooth as glass," Miller said, his voice a low rumble. "The Atlantic can be a different beast this time of year." "I'll take it," Sarah replied, smiling. "Better than the turbulence we had over the Rockies last week." The routine was a comfort, a predictable dance of checklists and communications. They were an hour past the point of no return, a concept that sounded more dramatic than it felt. The engines droned. The world below was a cloud-covered mystery, and all was right. Then, everything changed. It started with a gasp, a sharp, violent intake of air that made Sarah jump. She looked at Captain Miller, whose face had gone a terrifying shade of ashen gray. His hand, which had been resting on the yoke, was now a white-knuckled claw, clutching his chest. "Captain?" Sarah asked, her voice laced with fear. Miller didn't respond. His eyes were wide with a silent, profound terror. A choked sound escaped his lips, and he slumped forward, his head hitting the control panel with a sickening thud. The plane, for a terrifying moment, drifted. The nose dipped slightly, the engines giving a subtle, lurching moan. Panic, cold and visceral, shot through Sarah. She immediately took control, her hands a blur on the yoke as she corrected the course. She tried to rouse Miller, but he was unresponsive, his breathing a series of shallow, rattling gasps. Her mind, trained for every conceivable emergency, was suddenly a whirlwind of chaos. A heart attack, a medical emergency. The captain was incapacitated. She reached for the intercom, her hand shaking. "This is the co-pilot. We have a medical emergency in the cockpit. Is there a doctor on board?" Her voice, though she tried to keep it steady, was thin with panic. In the cabin, the lullaby of the engines was shattered by the frantic tone of the co-pilot's voice. The passengers stirred, a collective, questioning murmur rising from the seats. The flight attendants, trained for every eventuality, were now a picture of controlled chaos. They moved quickly, efficiently, checking on the passengers and trying to find the source of the emergency. The intercom crackled again, more urgently this time. "We have an unresponsive crew member. If there is a doctor, please identify yourself." A few rows ahead of Alex, a man in a crisp suit stood up. "I'm a cardiologist," he yelled. "Let me through." The flight attendants, their faces a mix of relief and terror, rushed to let him pass. But the chaos wasn't over. Another announcement, this one even more frantic, came over the intercom. "The captain is incapacitated. We have a medical emergency in the cockpit. We need a pilot. Is there a certified pilot on board?" This was the call that sent a chill through the cabin. A pilot. The word hung in the air, heavy with the weight of their collective fate. The murmur of the crowd turned into a desperate, frightened hum. Passengers looked at each other, their eyes wide with fear. The businessman on his laptop, the young couple holding hands, they all understood the implication. The person who was supposed to be flying the plane was no longer flying it. The flight attendants, pale and visibly shaken, walked the aisles, their pleas becoming more desperate. "A certified pilot, anyone, in seat 1 to see." Alex closed his book. He had been listening, of course. His quiet exterior was a carefully constructed mask, and underneath it, his mind was racing. He wasn't just a passenger. He was a silent observer, a student of detail. He had heard the initial lurch, the co-pilot's initial gasp. He had been calculating the plane's trajectory, its altitude, and its airspeed with a practiced, almost subconscious ease. He stood up. He was not a tall man, but he carried himself with a quiet authority that made him seem bigger. He made his way to the front of the plane, moving against the panicked tide of people. A flight attendant, her face a mask of desperation, blocked his path. "Sir, we need everyone to remain in their seats. This is a medical emergency." "I heard the call," Alex said, his voice calm and even. "You need a pilot." The flight attendant's eyes, red with unshed tears, narrowed in disbelief. "You're a pilot?" "Yes," Alex said simply. "Which airline are you with?" she asked, her tone shifting from desperation to suspicion. "What's your last certification?" "I don't fly for an airline," Alex said. "I'm a former pilot. Now let me through." "Sir, I can't let you into the cockpit without some form of ID," she stammered, her voice wavering. She had to buy the book, follow protocol. She had to ask. But her eyes were fixed on the door to the cockpit, a sealed portal to their potential demise. "Look," Alex said, not unkindly, "I'm not trying to be difficult. I was a pilot in the Air Force. F-16s. Now please, let me through. You're running out of time." The flight attendant's jaw went slack. "Coat." She stared at him, her mind unable to reconcile the quiet man in the gray hoodie with the image of a fighter pilot. F-16s, those weren't commercial jets. They were instruments of war, of impossible speed and maneuverability. This man, she thought, might as well be an alien. I don't know," she said, her voice trailing off. "You don't have to know," Alex said, his voice now a low command. "You just have to open the door." The cardiologist, who was now tending to the stricken pilot, looked up and saw the exchange. He saw the quiet, unwavering authority in Alex's eyes. "Let him in," the doctor said, his voice firm. "You can argue about it later." The flight attendant, Her professionalism, battling with her instincts, made a decision. She keyed the code into the cockpit door, and it hissed open. Alex walked through without a backward glance, stepping into a world of controlled chaos. The cockpit was a scene of frantic motion. The co-pilot, Sarah, was pale and sweating, her hands a blur on the controls. The plane was banking slightly to the left, a subtle but unnerving movement. The readouts were flashing red warnings. "Who are you?" Sarah demanded, her voice a brittle shout. She was dealing with a medical emergency, a plane that was in trouble, and now an intruder. It was too much. "My name is Alex," he said, his voice calm, a stark contrast to the storm around them. "I'm a pilot. What's our situation?" "The captain's had a heart attack. The plane is drifting. We're losing our position," she rattled off, her words tumbling over one another. "I can't keep it steady. The air traffic control is asking for a check-in, and I can't respond. I don't know what to do." Alex took in the scene with a quick, practiced eye. The readouts, the flashing lights, the co-pilot's frantic movements. He saw a pilot, a good one, who was overwhelmed by a crisis she wasn't trained to handle. She was trained for emergencies, yes, but not for this specific, soul-crushing combination. "All right," Alex said, and his voice was no longer that of a passenger, but a commander. "Step away from the yoke." Sarah stared at him, her eyes wide with a mix of fury and fear. "Are you out of your mind? I'm the pilot in command. I'm not just going to hand over the controls to some passenger." "I'm not a passenger anymore," Alex said, his eyes locking with hers. "And you're not in command. Not right now. The captain is down. You are overwhelmed. You have seconds before you lose it. I need you to trust me. Now, step away, Sin." There was a finality in his voice, a certainty that brooked no argument. Sarah, looking at the man whose eyes held a deep, profound calm, a calm that she had been searching for, saw a lifeline. She didn't trust him with her head, but her instincts, honed by years of training, screamed at her to follow. She took her hands off the yoke, her body trembling with a mixture of fear and relief. Alex took her place, his hands settling on the yoke. The feel was alien to him. An F-16 was a finely tuned instrument, an extension of the pilot's will. This was a bus, a lumbering behemoth of steel and fuel, but the principles were the same. The laws of physics, the mechanics of flight, were universal. "What are you doing?" Sarah whispered, as he made a series of quick, sharp corrections that were far too abrupt for a commercial jet. "Stabilizing the airframe," Alex said, his eyes fixed on the horizon. "We're not going to fly this thing like a bus. We're going to fly it like a fighter jet." He began to give orders, his voice a metronome in the cacophony. "Air traffic control is on the main frequency, I assume. Okay. Get me a direct line to a military base. A naval base, if possible. They'll have better resources. And tell them we have an incapacitated pilot and an unauthorized pilot on board. Tell them we're requesting a priority landing." Sarah, still in a state of shock, followed his commands. Her fingers flew over the communications console, her mind a blank slate of obedience. She listened to the calm, authoritative voice next to her, the voice that was now her only hope. "I need you to get the engine readouts for me," Alex said, his voice a low command, "and the fuel reserves. I need to know our limits. As Sarah relayed the information, Alex was working. He wasn't just flying the plane. He was commanding it. He was feeling its every nuance, its every shudder and groan. Tumpi was reading the wind and the air with a pilot's instinct, not a machine's calculation. He was using skills he hadn't used in a decade, skills honed in the cockpit of a single-seater fighter, now applied to a wide-bodied passenger jet. He began a series of maneuvers that would have made any commercial pilot cringe. He banked the plane far more steeply than was comfortable, a move designed to shed altitude quickly and efficiently without losing speed. He used the flaps not for landing, but for a series of small, controlled corrections that kept the plane from swaying. The air traffic controller, who was now on the line, was getting increasingly agitated. Flight 714. What is your status? We are seeing highly erratic flight patterns. Are you in a hostile situation? Sarah, her voice now steady with a newfound purpose, responded. Negative. We have an uncertified pilot in command. He's taking us down. Stand by for a priority landing. Uncertified pilot. You are not cleared to land, the controller yelled. You must get clearance from the ground. We don't have time for a clearance, Alex said, his voice cutting through the intercom. He was listening, of course. Tell them we're on an intercept course for London, and tell them to get the runway clear. We're coming in hot. The flight was no longer a graceful ballet. It was a desperate, chaotic dance. Alex was pushing the plane to its limits, using every trick he knew, every maneuver he had in his arsenal. The passengers, looking out the windows, saw a sight that was both terrifying and miraculous. The plane was moving with a speed and a grace that was not normal. It was a bird of prey, swooping and diving, a graceful hunter. Alex was no longer thinking about flying a passenger plane. He was thinking about a landing strip in the middle of a war. Kay was thinking about a damaged jet, an engine on fire, a mission gone wrong. He was thinking about 100 variables, 1,000 calculations, all of them happening in a split second. We're coming in too fast, Sarah yelled, her voice bordering on a scream. We're going to overshoot the runway. No, we're not, Alex said, his eyes fixed on the horizon. I'm using a military approach. It's unconventional. I'm going to bleed off speed in the final seconds. You just get ready to deploy the brakes. And I mean hard. The ground rushed up to meet them. The runway, a strip of concrete in a sea of green, looked impossibly small. The plane was screaming, the wind a dull roar. He could hear the passengers' gasps, their collective terror. He could feel Sarah's fear next to him, a palpable, living thing. He pulled back on the yoke, his hands a blur of motion. The nose of the plane came up, and for a terrifying moment, it felt as if they were going to stall. But he held it, his every muscle, his every sinew, acting on instinct. He was a part of the plane, a part of the machine. And then, with a bone-jarring thud, the wheels hit the tarmac. Not a perfect, soft landing. A rough, hard, ugly landing that sent a shockwave through the plane. The luggage in the overhead bins rattled. The passengers screamed. And for a second, it felt as if they were going to skid off the runway and into a ditch. Brakes. Alex yelled. Sarah, who had been holding her breath, slammed down on the brake pedals. The plane shuddered, the tires smoking, the smell of burning rubber filling the cabin. The sound was deafening, a screaming protest from the machine. But it worked. The plane, against all odds, slowed. It careened to a stop, its nose pointing at the end of the runway, a mere few feet from the grass. Silence. A profound soul-shaking silence descended upon the cabin. Tensions, which had been a low roar, now were a gentle whimper. The plane sat still, a bruised, broken monument to a miracle. Then, the applause started. A trickle at first, then a roar. The passengers, who had been in a state of terror, now were in a state of pure, unadulterated relief. They cheered, they clapped, they wept. They had been saved by a man in a gray hoodie, a ghost in the crowd, a fighter pilot who had flown a commercial jet as if it were his own personal F-16. Sarah, who was still shaking, looked at Alex. He was breathing heavily, his brow furrowed in concentration. She looked at his hands, which were now resting on the yoke, not with a white-knuckled grip, but with a gentle, weary calm. She looked at his face, which was a mask of exhaustion, and for the first time, she saw a hero. The paramedics rushed onto the plane, heading for the cockpit. They took Captain Miller away on a stretcher. He was alive, his breathing now regular, a faint pulse fluttering in his neck. The doctor told Sarah he would survive, that he was going to be all right. Alex, a man who had never sought attention in his life, was now the center of it. The flight attendants, the passengers, the ground crew, they all wanted to shake his hand, to thank him, to know his story. He simply smiled, a weary, tired smile, and shook his head. "I was just a passenger," he said, his voice a low murmur. I knew a thing or two." He walked off the plane, a quiet hero, and disappeared into the crowd. The journalists, who had been waiting for the story of a lifetime, found him hours later at the airport bar, having a beer, still wearing his gray hoodie, still reading his dog-eared paperback. He told them he was just a man who had done what he was trained to do. But Sarah knew the truth. She knew that he was more than that. He was a testament to a different kind of training, a different kind of calm. He had saved them all with an unconventional, impossible act, a blend of logic and instinct that only a fighter pilot could have. He was their unlikely hero, the man in 12C who had become their savior, the quiet ghost who had revealed himself to be an angel of the sky.